This is the Boardroom Exchange. From Macro Capital.
So, Noel Campbell, thanks for joining the show. You're the former Australian ambassador to a few countries, actually. So, Argentina, Spain, former Yugoslavia, and UAE. So you're the right person to ask the question, and it's what the hell is going on in the world of politics today? Because I am absolutely confused.
I guess it depends on who you ask, Conrad, but obviously there are a few hotspots around, no question about that. We just need to think of Ukraine, Myanmar, Syria, in our own region, the DPRK, the South China Sea, Taiwan Straits, so lots of things going on, as you say. But that's not absolutely unprecedented. I think over the last 60 or 70 years, there have been many hotspots, but fortunately the international system has been able to contain them for the most part.
Do we need to be worried? That's my main.
I don't think we need to be any more worried than we have for the last decade or so. I mean, the last few years, obviously, with the United States drawing back from its international engagement, there was a bit of nervousness. Who's going to take the lead if there is a disaster? But we've got over that question mark now, a return to a more balanced foreign policy on the part of the United States. But more than the hotspots, Conrad, I think are the transnational issues. I mean, the biggest single issue facing the international community right now is how to deal with COVID, not only as a health problem, but as an economic problem. And I think that that's still a process that's got to work itself out. It's not completely unprecedented, but gee, it was back in 1918 to 1920 that the Spanish flu, which killed about 40 to 50 million people, occurred. And we've moved on a lot since then. The World Health Organization has been put into place. There are mechanisms through which governments can try to discuss the challenges, discuss options for solutions. Australia, as you know, played a part in that in May of last year when we called for an international investigation into the origins and handling of COVID so that the international community can be better prepared in the future. Now, that was a controversial stand, and we've been castigated in a sense as a result of that, but it's a case of Australia using the multilateral system to try and play a constructive part in order to address similar problems in the future. But COVID's not the only transnational issue, if you think about it. International crime, drugs, natural disasters. There are many issues that require international coordination and collaboration. Climate change, anything to do with environmental threats, doesn't recognise boundaries, it requires international solutions.
And there's only a certain amount of resources too, right? I mean, and I think one of the most complicated, or foundationally, one of the most complicated things to solve as a, let's say, from the perspective of the UN even, is that it's not a single problem, you know, and a lot of these problems don't have conclusive solutions where it's as simple as, okay, well, you know, I think I was watching something on the internet where it was talking about, you know, you stop deforestation, and people start using coal more, you know, so that it's highly sophisticated, some of these problems, and I guess one of the issues right now is that there's a lot happening at the same time, but we've only got a certain amount of resources. I mean, would you say, I guess, the way we're handling these problems from a priority standpoint, do you think that we're doing that properly? Is that efficient, or is there a disproportionate value put towards, let's say, coronavirus? Although it's a massive issue right now compared to some of the issues that you've obviously seen and that are ongoing at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to set a firm agenda because you've got 190 countries who have a different view on what the priorities ought to be. So
they speak the different languages too.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So it's very difficult to prioritise because what you may consider to be a priority could be a second drawer issue for another country. But as you say, there are many issues bubbling at the same time. And right now, some of them are existential, if we want to talk about climate change. Some of them are very challenging because they haven't happened for a century, like COVID. Others have been ongoing for many, many years and are sort of evolving as conditions evolve. Talk about the international trading system. As countries evolve, barriers come down. If a disaster strikes, we just need to think of what's going to happen in the light of COVID. Some countries will want to protect their national industries in order to protect jobs. Other countries like Australia will say, hang on, we're for an open economy. It serves our national interest to trade. We rely on trading. That seems to be the predominant view these days. But even having rules in place, an international rules-based system is fundamental to Australia's prosperity. It's the only way that we can have an input. It's the only way that we can influence outcomes, because we're not a superpower. But where you have countries who decide to thumb their nose at the international trading system, or who decide to do things off their own bat in terms of human rights violations, these are things that challenge the multilateral system, and that is indeed a worry for countries like Australia, because it's the system that has served us well. It is a system in which all nation states have an opportunity to participate. So my concern, just going back to your original question, is more about the fate of the international rules-based system than what it is about individual conflicts, which, as you've said, can be very difficult to resolve through the international process, mainly because different countries have different perspectives. If you're talking about the UN, or the UN Security Council, 5 permanent member states have got a veto power, so that makes it doubly difficult to reach solutions on some of the more specific conflicts that I mentioned right at the outset.
A common opinion that I think the general public have in regards to the UN, right? I actually studied a subject, international relations, in uni. Not that it's enough for me to hold this conversation effectively with you, Noel, but one of the things that I guess we touch on in that subject is that it's, the UN, and this is again sort of somewhat what the general public, perceive it as, is it's obviously not law, or they don't have any powers besides these, embargoes and trade barriers they can put out for specific countries that are not abiding by the customary practices that they're looking to put forward. But it's quite, at the moment there's so many different, I would say, or at least from a media standpoint, so many issues that are right in front of us. Not just COVID, but let's say just the Chinese-US trade tensions, and even Australia. I want to know your opinion. We grabbed a coffee a while back, and I asked you this question because it was something that I wanted to know for potentially, our research division at Macro. But how has Australia handled the Chinese and Australian tensions, do you think, or the trade sort of issues at the moment? Do you think it's from here there's a way out that's amicable for both parties, or are we going to have to, look to diversify our basket a little bit?
I think that it's very easy after the event to say how better we could have done how better we could have approached a certain issue. And I guess the example I gave earlier about Australia taking the lead, if you will, on calling for an international investigation into COVID more generally is a good example.
Because we didn't have to do that. We didn't have to, but as a good international citizen, we want to get to the bottom of it so that we can develop preventative measures in the future, so that we can respond better. But it could have been anybody else.
The mistake, if there was a mistake, is perhaps it would have been more sensible to try and pull together a coalition of like-minded countries. In the event, 145 countries co-sponsored the resolution in the WHO that called for the investigation. So clearly there was a body of countries who were well disposed to the concept. I think on reflection, in hindsight, perhaps it would have been more sensible to arrange a coalition of countries and together push for the idea of an investigation. In the event, the EU countries took the lead from us, but clearly the offence had been taken, and the consequences that you mentioned we're grappling with right now.
I want to dive very deep into, I guess, what the psychological and even just the practical reality is of international relations, and you're the best person to find that information out from. But before we get into that, I want to, I guess, how does someone, I guess, do this? How does someone get into being a former ambassador of Australia, or being an ambassador of Australia for multiple countries? Is it, from my understanding, it's got to be a pretty selective process. So yeah, tell me about, I guess, your journey and how it actually all started.
Well, I guess there's a short version and a long version. The short version, Conrad, is I answered an ad in the Canberra Times, but clearly there was a little more to it than that. My studies, my university background lent itself to foreign policy. I studied international relations and then did law, specialising in international law. So I had a certain background that predisposed me to this sort of career. I think, as you say, it's fair to say it's a fairly competitive process. Generally, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade takes on about 35 diplomatic trainees each year, and I was fortunate enough to be one of them, but there are several hundred, if not thousands, who
How many applicants
apply.
would you say, roughly?
Listen, I think the year that I applied, it was something like 5,000 or 6,000.
Wow.
But many people don't make first base because they don't have a university degree, or imagine that the Foreign Service is a giant cocktail circuit, and are disheartened when they find out it's a little more than that. But yeah, that's the sort of background that I had. I also had this altruistic streak that has probably remained with me throughout my career, which is being involved in resolving disputes is better than engaging in disputes. And I still firmly believe that diplomacy has an important role to do that. But of course, it's well and good to have a degree. It's well and good to have an altruistic wish to try and resolve disputes peacefully. But the trick is what skills do you need? What methods do you use to do that? And we could discuss this all morning, but let me just make a couple of points in terms of a skill set. Obviously, someone would need to have good communication skills. You're going to be engaging with folks in other countries, foreign ministries in other countries, or you're going to be participating in an international conference. There are many different forums in which you can exercise your powers of diplomacy, if you will. You've also got to be a good negotiator. Clearly, the objective in an engagement is to arrive at an agreed solution. Your counterpart may have a completely different view of the world, or if you're negotiating an international agreement, he may want completely different obligations to be in the treaty or the agreement that's being negotiated. So having good negotiation skills, how to arrive at a consensus, is really, really important. But also, I think beyond that, you've got to have I guess what I'd call cultural intelligence. You've got to be able to size up the interlocutor from the other country that you may be accredited to or engaged with in an international negotiation. I think we've discussed before, Conrad, that dealing with interlocutors in an Asian country can be quite different from dealing with an interlocutor from the United States. Generally, there is a degree of formality that you don't find, say, in the US or Canada or the UK or New Zealand. One has to respect that, because the two essential ingredients to conducting diplomacy effectively, in my view, are trust and respect. You're never going to have the credibility to put a different point of view if you're disrespectful, if you jump into a conversation, if you're very aggressive in a society that values discussing things first before arriving to the nub of the point. Even something as simple as introductions can be, as you know, quite a ritual in some countries. You produce your card, you hand it over, you study your card, and then you respectfully put it away. Whereas an Australian's intuitive response, something is grab the card, put it in your suit pocket, and look at it when you get home. So all I'm saying is that you need to be sensitive to the culture in which you're operating in many cases as well. I think negotiating or having I mean, diplomacy is basically the art of encouraging someone to take your view, or to encourage someone to have your way.
Which is hard, which is very, very hard, and I think a lot of people don't. I mean, just to jump in here, firstly, it's quite, I think, amazing, you know, the fact that the skill sets required to do the job that you did so many years were, you know, these are skill sets that you don't really learn from a general educational standpoint, right? You can definitely study everything that you need to study for, let's say, political sciences and what have you, economics. But studying culture, it's kind of like one of those, it's like when someone's traveled a lot and you go, oh, like that guy, he just gets it. There's something about him that is just a little bit more open-minded. He's seen other experiences. He's seen other people go through something totally different to what he's used to. And I think that's the skill set of open-mindedness that's a mandatory thing to be able to influence them. And I just unpack this because there's a lot to unpack. So you mentioned, you know, it's like respect. You know, it's one thing to have a relationship with someone as an ambassador. Not that I'm going to claim to know what that's like, but you know, if I put myself in your shoes for a moment, it's like, okay, you're going in with an agenda. You know, the Prime Minister or the policies that are set out for you are in place. They've been, you know, formulated, discussed, and you know, you have a specific objective, a strategic objective to achieve. Yeah. Now, if you go in these meetings, and I'm assuming there are some very powerful people that you've sat, you know, across from, you know, most likely you're going to get thrown around unless you sort of have a firm line as to what you want to put forward, and that's that whole art of negotiating. And I think, you know, negotiation is just as much understanding where their circumstances are as it is you portraying what you want. And it sounds like, from what you're saying, that's a skill set that was developed, you know, for quite some time.
Yeah, I think a lot of things, obviously, you're going to learn on the job, as you say. There's
Who have you seen? I mean, in these, when you learn on the job, any formidable, you know, leaders that you can tell us some stories about?
Well, where do I start? I'm not going to pretend that I've had one-on-one meetings with some of them, but there's certainly people I've met or sat in meetings with, ranging from Vladimir Putin when I was working with the International Atomic Energy Agency.
What's he like?
I don't think charismatic would be the first adjective to spring to mind.
Oh, really?
He's not charismatic.
Oh, well.
On the other hand, he's clearly decisive. He's clearly...
Do the YouTube videos do him justice? Because that's all we get actually.
Well, I didn't see him riding on horseback shirtless, but I think he's very smart. He's very driven. And he is very decisive in the way that he interacts. Clearly, we were talking at that particular meeting with the Director General of the IAEA about Russia's nuclear program, about the importance of having verification, about the importance of preventing proliferation of nuclear technology into the wrong hands. And to be quite frank, we were on the same page on all of those things, so it wasn't a
that's good to know.
Yeah.
Good to know.
But who else? Again, in that same capacity, when I was working as Chief of Staff to the Director General, meeting with then President Khatami of Iran.
Wow.
Iran is clearly a sensitive country when we come to nuclear technology. This was way back in the early 2000s, before the comprehensive agreement was negotiated. But again, the Director General had to be fairly forceful about underlining the importance of allowing inspection teams in to make sure that Iran's nuclear program was indeed peaceful. Also making the point that geopolitics meant that the negotiation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was a bargain between giving countries access to nuclear technology for peaceful purposes on the one hand, but giving up any ideas about developing nuclear weapons themselves. So just reinforcing bits of international practice and international agreements that were already out there. But who else have I met? For goodness sake, again, when I was accredited as ambassador to certain countries, you mentioned Yugoslavia, I met Slobodan Milosevic, which again was an interesting personality to meet.
And that must be rewarding too.
Curiously, much more worldly and even charming in a way, given the ruthless way that he rose to power and subsequently messed up, if you will, in Kosovo, and basically his actions, along with the other super-nationalist leaders of the former Yugoslavia, played the nationalism card to a great extreme, to the extent that the country broke apart. But more recently, again, when one presents credentials as ambassador, one meets the head of state. Those are usually very formalistic occasions, but occasionally they can be interesting and be a source of anecdotes afterwards. My most recent posting was ambassador to Argentina, and I remember well when the then President Macri was inaugurated. Part of the routine is to meet the diplomatic corps. It's usually a fairly perfunctory shaking of hands, and once you've shaken 190 hands, I imagine he's very pleased to have ticked that box. But I recall very distinctly, because I was halfway down the row of hands he was shaking, and I said, "Congratulations, Mr. President, Ambassador from Australia. We're a country very similar to Argentina, and we have undergone, over the last few decades, a period of reform." And he dutifully said, "Yes, very nice to meet you," and went on to my neighbour. A few moments later, he came back and he said, "Yes, Australia, you did it right. You're a big country just like that. Like us, you're a country rich in resources. You're a country of migrants, but you did it correctly. I want to know how you did it." And that was sort of, that went viral on YouTube for a day or so.
Wow.
But that was a great entree for me to have been acknowledged as coming from a country that was very similar to Argentina, if you think about it, yet had had 28 years of continuous economic growth, whereas Argentina had been on a bit of a roller coaster of economic boom and bust over the last couple of decades.
Does it ever get nervous? I mean, you're meeting, I'm assuming, like anything, you get used to it, right? Or like anything, sometimes the world forces you to step up to the plate and you just have to go with it. But share with me, is it as daunting as it sounds, meeting these, I mean, even being in the same room as Putin I would have very sweaty hands, at the least.
Listen, I think, again, I repeat, don't imagine it was a one-on-one conversation between me and Putin. It wasn't. But being present when there was a fairly significant conversation was an interesting experience as an observer, being a fly on the wall, if you like. Similarly, when I've accompanied my boss, in that case, on other meetings with
who would have been the Prime Minister?
Beg your pardon?
Your boss would have been the Prime Minister at the time? Or?
Well, I guess formally any ambassador's boss is the Foreign Minister, I guess.
Correct, yeah.
So we're not like the private sector. I mean, I'm not a CEO in the sense that I make the final decisions. There are certain decisions and certain responsibilities I do have autonomy for as an ambassador. But clearly, as you mentioned before, you work within the parameters of whatever the government policy of the day is. As a career diplomat, I serve under whatever government happens to be in place in Australia. Some countries have the practice of having political appointees. If there's a change of government, there's a change of many of the important ambassadors. Australia, fortunately, doesn't have that system. So, yeah, I operate according to certain parameters, which are government policy of the day. And sometimes, if it's a difficult policy to sell, it can be a difficult case, and one can get apprehensive, if you like, about how one is going to try and achieve the objective one wants. Let me give you an example. I was a political counsellor in our embassy in Washington in the late 1980s. There had just been an important negotiation that took several years to conclude to regulate mining activities in Antarctica. Then all of a sudden, then Prime Minister Bob Hawke and the French Prime Minister Michel Rocard decided that actually this was kind of going against the stream. The environmental movement was just starting. Sustainable development was a buzzword. And they said, actually, that would be a very risky proposition for the world, engaging in mining activities in this pristine environment that's Antarctica. So they started a campaign instead to drop the idea of a convention to regulate mining activities and instead negotiate a protocol on environmental protection of Antarctica, which would actually involve, pardon the pun, a freeze on mining activities for a long period, and almost an indefinite period. Trying to persuade the United States, which was very wedded to the idea of, hey, you know, new resources, activities, commercial opportunities in Antarctica, was very, very difficult. And one had to use a whole range of diplomatic skills, finding allies in the United States, which could be members of Congress or members of the opposition party in Congress. I remember finding a very valuable ally in Senator Al Gore, who subsequently became vice president. But at that time, it was under the Bush senior administration. He was in opposition, but he was the head of one of the very key committees on science and technology, and was able to have hearings on the issue where all sides and the pros and cons of an environmental protocol could be aired. So there was a public debate. It also involved in persuading the ambassador to write think pieces or op-eds in the media. It involved trying to find allies amongst the NGO community or civil society. So trying to persuade a country to change its position can be daunting, yes. But as in that case, not impossible. We were able to build an alliance of countries who thought the same way that we did, who were also able to exercise influence on countries that were previously wedded to the mining agreement.
What do you do when, because a negotiation is two ways, right? It's a two-way streak, and what I mean by that is if the other party is irrational, well, there's no hope. Sometimes it doesn't matter what the problem is. You know, I guess what I'm getting to is when you're sitting across someone that you're needing to negotiate or discuss a topic of high importance, and they're, you know, for a lack of a better word, just a prick, right?
Yes.
Closed-minded, you know, obviously completely self-interested and not able to compromise on any topic. I mean, you know, we're seeing it now. We're seeing it now in many cases. What's a strategy that you've employed or an experience that you've had with that? And yeah, tell us a little bit about how you solved it.
Yeah, I mean, this often boils down to a personality thing in some cases. If you have a very aggressive personality that you're dealing with, a very inflexible personality, then you have to adjust your diplomatic skills accordingly. One way is to invite the person out to lunch and say, listen, we've got different views on this issue.
Change the environment.
And see if you can, in that more informal, relaxed environment, get to the bottom of what's driving them. Is it his particular personal view that's intervening here? Is it a firm commitment that his government has? Is it a misunderstanding of what I'm saying? Maybe I'm not putting the case lucidly enough. I think any negotiator has to be very knowledgeable of the subject matter of the issue. Obviously, you're not going to have a hope in hell of convincing somebody if you're not yourself familiar with the issue. You've got to size up the. You've got to do some homework, as in size up what's driving the other side. What are the points of conflict here? And I think you've also got to go into a negotiation with a mindset that, as a fallback, you may have to compromise in some way. So you have to prioritise the issues that are really, really important to Australia, and those that maybe we can fudge a little, or maybe we can concede on, in return for getting your way on the more important point.
Have you found Australia to be, for most of the issues, in a position of power when it comes to compromisation, not needing to do that at all? Or have you found yourself in especially the post that you've had, we've got no choice, we've got to let this one slide, he's got to get his way? Is there an imbalance there at all, or?
Well, I think there's a difference between trying to push a bilateral agenda where you're just dealing with one country, your host country, and if you're in a multilateral context where you're trying to negotiate an agreement, it's much more difficult in the multilateral organisation in some ways, because you've got 192 players. But having said that, very clearly there are many countries that are like-minded, if you wish, that have a similar point of view to us. But in any negotiating context, you try and make new alliances, you try and reach across different groups so that you can arrive at compromises. So you have to temper your sense of commitment to what your way is with the bigger picture of trying to get an agreement or a position accepted that meets you halfway or gets most of what you want. But I think that's the same in the private sector. You have to have a commitment and a drive, it's true, but you have to be prepared to concede if you wish to get your priority position accepted.
I think it's interesting to see that there's fundamental concepts that, like you said, are shared across private sector, across the industries. I mean, law, negotiating in any type of business deal, and interacting with people, even on a social level, between different dynamics, a boss and an employee. We just had, last week we had Johnny Wilkinson from Equitize, and we were discussing sort of the issues that he faces as an entrepreneur. And it's, at the end of the day, what we're finding, and what I've found in my very limited years of life so far, Noel, is that sometimes it's the same thing, just different. Bigger numbers maybe, and add an extra zero to it, different impacts if it doesn't go your way, different risks. But this idea that we're influencing action between people, and you either compromise or you either stick to your guns and nothing gets resolved. For example, the nuclear is a great example of this, right? Where it's like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming we're still in like a stalemate deterrent situation. One guy, bombs another state, and we've got a reverse action happening pretty quickly, so they just don't do it to each other. I guess whatever the risks are and the magnitudes of it all, it comes down to this idea of it's psychology, really. It's still a lot of psychology. Understanding the other person or the other party, and I'm assuming it gets a hell of a lot more complicated in the international relations department. Tell me, what's some major challenges? What's been absolutely horrific for you during the career, as far as a problem from an international relations standpoint?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I took 4 years off from the Foreign Service and worked with the International Atomic Energy Agency. One particular moment in time I recall very vividly was 9/11.
Oh, wow.
It was actually a meeting of the governing body of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and very fortuitously they were discussing nuclear security.
Wow.
And immediately after we all got over our feeling of horror and disbelief, we thought, Jesus, if this had happened at a nuclear facility instead of the Twin Tower buildings, this could have been catastrophic. So immediately minds were focused on, well, what more should we be doing to ensure that nuclear facilities are secure from miscellaneous 747 civilian aircraft or a terrorist act. I mean, this was a very serious and very real risk. So that was the beginning of what became quite an intensive period of trying to develop norms and practices to ensure that nuclear installations, whether they be a nuclear power plant or a nuclear research facility, were secure, so that if they were ever the object of a terrorist attack, then we could be confident that the physical premises would be secure. I think another period that was tremendously challenging for me, and this is the great privilege of being a diplomat, Conrad, in my experience, and this is purely fortuitous. You can't choose the time when you're going to be posted to a particular country. When I was in the United Arab Emirates, the conflict in Iraq started.
Oh, wow.
So that was a tremendous opportunity for me, because it meant that they would read my reports, because they were naturally very interested in what the perspective of the Gulf states were. They know Iraq. It's part of the Arab family, if you were. They can be a source of tremendous insight and perspective about how to engage, what the reaction's going to be in the region, how Iran is going to react to those sorts of things. So it was very satisfying professionally, even though it was a stressful time, being ambassador in a country, in a region where there was a very real conflict in which Australia was itself involved. Another example was when I was in Yugoslavia. Again, 94 to 97, the country had just disintegrated. What was left of Yugoslavia was under economic sanctions, very large flows of refugees. It was a challenging time, but a tremendously exciting time professionally, because again, it was either CNN or me. I knew that my reports were read. Now, we weren't a major player there, but we had interests in the former Yugoslavia because we had many communities from that region. In fact, our embassy was one of the most popular embassies in the city because so many people had relatives and thought that they'd like to go to Australia as well. So there were many different pressures that resulted from being at that particular time in history in Yugoslavia or in the UAE, as I say.
I wish we could sit here for 3 hours, not because I have so many other questions, but unfortunately we don't have the time. I'm going to try to ask a couple of questions to highlight to the audience a couple more things about what I find intriguing about yourself. One thing is you've come full circle in the sense that now you're teaching. Correct me if I'm wrong, you're a lecturer at ANU for Latin American Studies.
Yeah, I'm actually what's grandly called co-director of the Australian Centre for Latin American Studies. Right. It's mainly focused on raising awareness about Latin America in Australia and vice versa, engaging with similar institutions in Latin America. It's something I feel very passionate about. It's a job that I accepted on retirement with great enthusiasm, because it's an opportunity for me to give back, if you like, from the privileged career that I've had up until now. But I also firmly believe, and now more than any time, when we are under pressures from some of our major trading partners, I think an important lesson from that experience is the need to diversify our relationships, political, commercial, security, whatever. I think it's really put into sharp focus the vulnerability that we find ourselves in if we rely on a single trading partner too much. So part of my narrative, Conrad, is to say, okay, let's reflect and learn from that experience. Putting too many big eggs in a particular basket maybe wasn't the most sensible thing to do. You talked earlier about risk. Spreading the risk is surely a more rational thing to do. So nobody's saying neglect certain important partners. What we're saying is spread the risk. Look at new and emerging regions of the world, and I include Latin America amongst this. Why do I say that? It's 650 million people, 650 million potential customers if you want to look at it from a commercial perspective. It's a region which has a growing middle class. It has a GDP of $5.1 trillion. And just to put that in perspective, that's 75% larger than the GDP of the ASEAN countries with whom we attach very great importance. 3 Latin American countries are in the G20. In the year 2040, 2 of the 7 largest economies on the planet, Brazil and Mexico, will be located in Latin America. So work it out. Of course we should be having a second look at Latin America. Now many people say, oh yeah, but that's the United States and North America and Europe have got Latin America covered. Not so. These are growing economies. They have an appetite for many things that Australia produces. They have an appetite for looking at Australia as a model, if you like, looking at best practice they can take from Australia. One of the great things about being ambassador in Argentina at the time of the change of government, it went from a populist government to a centrist, centre-right government, was exactly as I mentioned before, the Macri government saying, hey, we want to know how you, Australia, such a similar country, big country, federal system, rich in resources, mainly migrants, how did you do it? How did you develop a vocational education and training system? How did you reform your social security system? What role did the Productivity Commission play? Is that something we should be establishing here? And this was obviously a tremendous opportunity for me as an ambassador because I could share Australia's best practice. Several delegations came to Australia to see how we did it. But I'm just using that example to show that there are tremendous opportunities in that continent, Latin America. Nobody's saying they should replace our major partners. It's in addition to our major trading partners so that we can spread the risk. So that's what I'm firmly committed to right now. And as I say, it enables me to give something back to students and to academics and to the public, if you like, trying to educate or raise awareness about the opportunities that lie in Latin America.
I think one thing that anyone can be appreciative of is when a public servant, after being a public servant, still wants to give back and has the attitude that, they should return something to somebody. And look, that's one of the reasons why I think, Noel, you and I have a great relationship in the sense that a lot of our principles are aligned. I think, even taking it back to your statement about, it was an opportunity. When things were tough, your ability to look at, I guess, not the bright side, it's an oversimplification of what that was. It was, I think, more so your detachment, or your ability to detach yourself so that you can do your best work, so that your impact was of the most, efficient level. And so, I think we're honoured to have someone like yourself experience all of that and be on a platform like at the ANU and provide us with your again, further altruistic activities. Last question. It's a question that we want to ask every guest that we have on the show. We've called it the Boardroom Exchange podcast or vodcast. It doesn't have to be a boardroom meeting specifically. I mean, it sounds to me, based on what you've told me, the environment could be widely different. What is the craziest, and I'm going to love this one because you must have had some crazy ones. What is the craziest meeting or boardroom meeting, anything, interaction that you've had that you can share with us?
Well, I'm going to take you at your word when you say it doesn't necessarily have to be a boardroom because it did not occur in a boardroom. Let me give you 2 examples, one a facetious one and one a more serious one. The facetious one was when I was invited to what was in effect a rodeo in Argentina. It's an opportunity that they have every year to bring in the young gauchos who round up the calves who are going to be branded. So as ambassador, I was invited to this very special event. It was very early in the morning, and I thought, this is great, you know, it's really going to be a cultural experience for me. What I didn't know was at the same time as branding them, they also snip the male calves. Not only do they snip them, but they then serve them as a dish. Now, I knew they were trying to intimidate the Australian ambassador, but I wasn't going to have a bar of that. So I can look you in the eye and say, I indeed partook of the bull's testicles.
Wow.
And asked myself at the end of that, the things I do for the nation. So that was the facetious comment. Way distant from a boardroom decision, but an exercise in diplomacy, I hope you'll agree.
And I'm sure, and that must be a tactic that they use, the big cultural different type of sort of pressured environments. Fantastic.
Well, I felt that I got 10 extra points because I actually did it and didn't flinch for a moment.
Fantastic.
The second one is slightly more serious, but alas, not in a boardroom either. I've talked a lot about the importance of building trust and respect. And this is particularly important in societies like the United Arab Emirates, which is a very traditional society, a very conservative society. It's not a democracy in the way we would understand a democracy. It's a monarchy. But I got to know very well the Crown Prince of the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, who was also the Chief of Defence Force. I met him in many contexts because of our defence engagement in Iraq at the time, many senior defence people coming through, including the Australian Chief of Defence. The Prime Minister came through, the Defence Minister came through. Wow. It was a very important staging point, if you like, for people who wanted to have better knowledge of what was going on in Iraq. But I developed quite a collegial relationship with him. I met him several times, as I say, and I got a phone call, my office got a phone call one day saying, is the ambassador free this afternoon to go for a walk with His Highness on the beach? So my PA immediately put the proposition to me, and I said, hell yeah, so yes. Not knowing what was coming, but thinking this was a great honour to be invited by the Crown Prince to go for a walk along the beach. Oh. So I dutifully went there. It was just one-on-one. He had some of his staff in the distance, but he wanted to have a talk to me one-on-one. And the discussion was basically to seek my views on options for a transition towards some more democratic institutions in the UAE. Oh, wow. Now, I'm not going to look you in the eye and pretend for a minute he took everything I said on board, but we did discuss transitional arrangements. We did discuss whether there should be universal suffrage or limited suffrage for a transitional period.
What an opportunity.
We did discuss what about women? Would women be part of the process? All I can tell you, Conrad, is that a year or so later, the UAE in the year 2006 had its first elections. These were for 50% of what's called the National Federal Council. The other 50% are appointed by the ruler. So it was a step towards democracy. But I was even more pleased a few years later when they reserved 50% of the elected members of the Federal National Council for women. So all I can say is those were issues that we discussed. I think and hope that he listened to me and thought about some of the things that I'd suggested. And although it wasn't a transition to a democracy in the way we understand it, to the democracy, they were steps that occurred along the way because I believe that I had the trust and respect in order to be able to say the things that I did. So that, for me, was one of the standout moments in my long career.
Noel, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate the time and the stories you were able to share with us. We'll have to have you back on the show again. So Yeah, we'll keep in touch. Thanks for
My
coming on.
pleasure. And again, I think one of the most important things that you surmised from all this is that many of the traits, the characteristics, the challenges that apply in the private sector apply equally in the private sector.
I think so.
In the public, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you.